Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings also to Dick and Rose Dawson. Okay, let me just start my timer. Yes. Okay. Can you hear me? If you can just indicate if I'm lost or if you can't hear me, please. So many have already observed the absence of lament in Christian communities and have tried to emphasize the importance of lament. Walter Brueggemann's article entitled "The Costly Loss of Lament" is one of the most quoted articles arguing for the crucial role of lament in the church or the life of faith. Yet despite the flurry of publications on lament, not only in biblical studies, but also in other disciplines, such as pastoral ministries and others, there appears to be, in my own observation, a continuing absence of lament. I remember before the lockdown, I was invited to preach to a church. It was the week when a tragic incident occurred. 22 of our Filipino fishermen were left floating in the sea after a Chinese vessel deliberately hit their boat, and they actually this news became viral, and I was hoping that Sunday there would be something in the church worship that would mention or at least allude to the incident, But there was nothing in the entire worship service about what happened to our 22 fishermen. Instead, the very first song we sang in the worship service was the song 10,000 Reasons by Mike Redman. And the chorus goes, "Bless the Lord, oh my soul. Worship his holy name. Sing like never before, oh my soul." I was in the front row of the church, and as I stood with the congregation, I found it hard to join in the singing. How can I sing like never before? How can I bless the Lord with all my soul after what just happened? You would think that with the pandemic, there would be more emphasis on lament. But according to the Christian Copyright Licensing International, out of the top 100 songs being sung in church at one point during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, there was only one song out of the 100 that could begin to be described as including lament. After 2 years of the pandemic, I was able to attend my first ever in-person Christian gathering here in the UK. This was a national conference of a major Christian organization with over 400 people. I thought there would be lament, not only because for 2 years we have been struggling with the pandemic, but also because while we were gathered there, Russia was invading Ukraine. As if the pandemic were not enough, we now have a war in our midst. But again, like my experience before the pandemic, again, we are singing the same song. You wouldn't believe it, no? Bless the Lord, oh my soul. Wow. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Why is there a continuing lack of realization of what Brueggemann says, costly loss of lament? Scholars have mentioned different reasons, and there are a lot of possible reasons to this. Let me just mention some of them. It could be sociological, according to Belden Lane, and I quote, "There is a comfortable triumphalism that too often has characterized the common prayer of enculturated Christianity." It could also be theological, where Walter Storff, in his article, "If God is good, why lament?" cites Augustine and Calvin, who, due to their emphasis on sin and suffering as part of the Christian life, respectively, have de-emphasized the lament or have hindered lament. But I think it's not just the theologians who are to be blamed for the continuing absence of lament. I think biblical scholars also have a part to play in the costly loss continuing costly loss of the lament. What has not been mentioned as one possible hindrance, or as one of the possible hindrances to realizing the costliness of lament, is the understanding of lament coming from the biblical scholars themselves. Biblical lament, as it has come to be understood in biblical studies, has been significantly influenced by Hermeneutics of Form criticism. Gang understands lament in terms of a movement, from lament to praise. And he writes, and I quote, "The order in many of the Psalms is a characteristic one. First, the wailing, almost desperate lament, then suddenly certainty of deliverance is out. And suddenly in response, certainty is given to the person lamenting, causing a sudden change of mood from lament to praise. Note, however, that lament did not say that all the lament psalms contain this sudden change of mood. He only said many, which means that there are other laments which do not conform to the characteristic order, lament to certainty. But Gunkel did not pay attention to the non-conforming lament. Westermann likewise emphasized only the movement from lament to praise. Actually, if you look at the presentation of the elements of the lament, Westermann basically follows Gunkel. Gunkel begins with invocation, complaint, petition, and then moves to certainty of a hearing and then vow. Westermann likewise begins with address, lament, and then moves to vow of praise. Westermann was amazed that, quote, "There are no psalms," he says, "which do not progress beyond petition and lament," end of quote. And though he acknowledges that the cry to God is sheer, never one-dimensional, without tension, says it is always somewhere in the middle between petition and praise. Though he said those things, he nonetheless asserts that lament is always underway from supplication to praise. And note the words "always underway." Okay? Because this phrase will become an often quoted phrase. Walter Brueggemann, in his well-known book, The Message of the Psalms, used it. He describes the movements from orientation to disorientation, and then the disorientation to new orientation as, I quote, two decisive moves of faith that are always underway, end of quote. Although Brueggemann insists that his grid is not meant to be taken too literally, his overall approach favors a form-critical view of the lament, which is characterized by this one-way movement from lament to praise. The title of one of Brueggemann's earliest articles, written almost 50 years ago, entitled "From Hurt to Joy, From Death to Life," is a clear endorsement of Gunkel and Westermann's view of the lament. In fact, he writes, "The study of the lament is best pursued by the methods of form criticism," end of quote. And even though he employed Paul Ricoeur's dialectic of orientation and disorientation, the form critical view remains the decisive influence. On page 17 of The Message of the Psalms, Brueggemann affirms that, and I quote, "Form critical approach is a great insight." And this influence of the form critical view of the one-way movement from lament to praise can be seen in studies all over in the Old Testament. And even if you look at studies in New Testament lament, they all just follow Gunkel and Brueggemann, this one-way movement. It has defined even in New Testament and even beyond into theology. And even within those studies which try to move beyond form criticism, quote unquote, in the Old Testament, such as the canonical studies of lament, the form critical view of the one-way movement from lament to praise continues to exert its influence. Raymond van Leeuwen simply takes for granted that Book 4 is the theological heart of the Psalter. Why? Because Book 4, the reason why it's regarded the heart of the Psalter is because it's where the answer to the problem at the end of Book 3 is found. Book 3 is ended, we know, with a tragedy, with a tragic ending in Psalm 89. That's why even though Book 3 is literally at the center of the 5 books of the Psalms, it cannot be the center because it contains no answer. Kevin Barker calls Book 3 as the darkest book of the Psalter. So why make the darkest book of the Psalter the center, the heart? We don't want that, isn't it? Don't we? The movement should be towards praise, away from the darkness. As Eric Ertland notes, the fourth book of the Psalter wastes no time in answering this tragedy. You notice this, there is a rush, towards moving right away to the answer. Book 4, and canonical scholars, those doing studies in canonical approaches to the Psalms try to emphasize that out as well. Notwithstanding the contributions of the dominant view of the lament, I see some problems with this view. First, the view of lament in terms of the movement, lament to praise, leads to an overemphasis on certainty. This is reflected in the term certainty of a hearing, which is always, usually quoted in standard commentaries. As Gunkel points out, lament may begin with a wailing, but there is certainty at the end. Always, But is this true? Or if not always, Gunkel says many, But is this true? Of course, we know it's not, because Psalm 88 never attains certainty until the end. Psalm 88, in fact, ends with darkness. But because the emphasis is on the certainty, even the absence of certainty in Psalm 88 is denied. Even when Brueggemann, in his article Psalms as Prayer, page 56, recognizes that there are unanswered prayers, he says there are times when Yahweh's chesed is not operative. He nonetheless asserts on the next page, on page 57, that, and I quote, Israel does not for a moment doubt Yahweh's chesed, end of quote. I find this remark misleading, especially because he was just talking about Psalm 88. Contrary to Brueggemann, the psalmist in Psalm 88 is lamenting the absence of Yahweh's chesed. Secondly, the overemphasis on certainty results to a one-sided emphasis on praise, because there is always certainty in the end. The ultimate response is always praise. As Broyles declares, praise should have the last word. Like Korean dramas or K-dramas, if you're watching them. By the way, they helped me during the time of pandemic, maintain my sanity. Korean, they have tensions in between, but they always have the happy ending underway, if I say. Third problem is with the form critical the dominant view of the lament is that lament becomes resolution-centered. For Gunkel, quote, in his introduction to the Psalms, the goal of the complaint song is to obtain something from Yahweh, end of quote. Similarly, Westermann says, quote, what the lament is concerned with is not a description of one's suffering or with self-pity. Of course, we know from Psalm 22 that the psalmist describes himself as a worm, not a man. And let me continue, but Westermann says the concern of the lament is the removal of the suffering itself. This is from his Praise and Lament, page 266. For Brueggemann, the crucial structural question is, and I quote, how does the speaker get from distress to relief? What transforms the mood? He wrote from hurt to joy, page 72. As a result of the overemphasis on certainty and the one-sided emphasis on the movement from lament to praise, lament comes to be understood mainly as petition or plea, because petition and plea, the cry, is directly linked to the resolution. So Broyles can say a lament is primarily an appeal. Westermann explains the inclusion of petition is all important, for it shows that the lament always functions as an appeal. So the question is, what is lament then? Is it just an appeal? How about grieving? How about, protest? And so you have these problems in terms of terminology, because what do you mean if you say lament is primarily or just an appeal? Furthermore, this one-sided emphasis on praise and resolution leads to the weakening, ironically, of the lament itself. Finds Gunkel's designation lament as problematic You don't call them lament. And he proposes that the songs of prayer, quote, should be used, or plea. Because for him, and I quote, there is no lamenting. Valentin says, lament's concern is not primarily with the portrayal of suffering, but with its removal and elevation. He quotes Westermann, who wrote, lamentation has no meaning in and of itself, end of quote. Of course, this is true, that lamentation has no meaning of itself, but we also need to emphasize that praise has no meaning in and of itself without the lament. But because of the one-sided movement towards praise, lament itself is diminished. For why lament when resolution is always underway anyway? Why remain in lament when the ultimate goal is one's deliverance? The one-sided view of the lament undermines the practice of protest, I think. For protest moves the opposite direction. It also views the practice of grieving and mourning as something that stands in the way or even a hindrance. Brueggemann does not consider, for example, funeral lament as biblical lament, for it has what Brueggemann calls, quote unquote, tragic reversal, which contradicts biblical laments, which has a saving reversal. It is surprising that even in an article which he wrote in 2011, in response to the 911 in 2001, Brueggemann continues to affirm this movement from lament to praise despite the many uncertainty. And I quote, he says, Israel is always moving, as did that generation of slaves, from lament to doxology, or with Westermann, from plea to praise, end of quote. Israel is, and those people in later generations know that, and he quotes Psalm 30 verse 5, weeping may linger for the night, but joy comes in the morning. But how about those who the other way around? Okay. What if the morning comes and there's no joy? The dominant view of the lament results in the loss of this tragic sense, which is expressed, I think, in some of the other laments which deviate from the usual dominant lament psalms. Biblical scholars in general have not given justice to what we actually find in the biblical laments. As I've noted earlier, the focus is only on the many, the dominant, the characteristic movement to praise, but we have ignored, neglected the other laments, and as a result, we miss their importance. For example, Gunkel lists Psalm 46 individual laments in his introduction to the Psalms, page 221. Among 15 Psalms containing certainty of a hearing. But even though he only cites 15 Psalms with certainty of a hearing out of the 46, he refers to this phenomenon as not uncommon. I think it should be not that common. But even granted that the movement, lament with the movement to praise is common, it is still not right to only highlight these. We should also give space, I think, highlight the other laments which differ from the dominant movement from lament to praise. For example, Psalm 9 and 10, which is actually one psalm, isn't it? Because they are composed using the Hebrew acrostic. It begins from 8, and then when we reach chapter 10, that's the letter Lamed, Aleph, Lamed, and then so it's not complete when you read only Psalm 9. And this Psalm 9 to 10 begins with thanksgiving, and then when you go to the middle, you have the lament. So it's the opposite, the other way around. Psalm 44 also begins with a recollection of God's marvelous acts of self-deliverance, but moves to bitter lament. And then, of course, Psalm 89, which is similar to Psalm 9 and 10, it too begins with thanksgiving, but moves to lament. I call these Psalms tragic lament. There is no vow of thanksgiving at the end. The overall movement is the opposite to the dominant lament, which moves from lament to praise. And I think that these tragic laments are very important because the church has been for a long time an overly tragic. It's also important because it helps us see and realize the seriousness of the problem and that it is tragic. If we only highlight the lament which always moves to praise, we miss this important tragic dimension. And Jeffrey Alexander's work on the cultural trauma demonstrates the importance of highlighting also the seriousness of the problem. The tragic lament is important because it puts grieving and protesting back to the proper place in the lament. That lamentation and plea, but that they're also grieving. One problem with the dominant view of the lament, biblical lament, is that it is Psalms-centric. But we also need to consider the Book of Lamentations. For example, it highlights and reinforces the importance of grieving and protesting. If they say that lament is mainly plea, how do you interpret the grieving and the mourning in the Book of Lamentations? How do you interpret the whole book? Indeed, it doesn't have any response, any movement to praise until the very end. And I think we need the tragic lament because it presents to us precisely this, the reality of life. This is where many people are today, isn't it? No certainty, no answer, and it is tragic. Interestingly, these tragic laments found in strategic places in the Psalter. For example, Psalm 9 and 10 subverts the emphasis on praise in the structure of Book 1, particularly Psalms 3 to 14. According to Eric Zenger, the hymn of Psalm 8 is the center of the laments in Psalm 3 to 14. But if this is true, that it is interesting that the hymn is immediately followed by Psalm 9 and 10, which I call tragic lament. Psalm 44 is also found at the beginning of Book 2, preceded, of course, by Psalm 42 and 43. And the Psalm 89 is at the end of Book 3. And it's interesting, both Psalms 44 and 89 are preceded by individual laments, which for example, Psalm 42, 43 also lacks any immediate closure. At the end, he continues to ask, tell his soul, praise the Lord. Why so downcast, O my soul? Question there. And then, of course, you have Psalm 88. Is there a deliberate ordering or placement of the tragic laments? And if there is, what is the possible purpose of this arrangement? What are they trying to convey? Are they trying to subvert the dominant movement in the Psalter? These are the questions that require more time. Unfortunately, I only have 3 minutes left. But briefly, I think that these tragic laments are strategically placed to subvert the dominant movement. If you notice, even in Book 5, we see a reverse movement from the great hymns of Psalm 135, 136, which sing of God's steadfast love enduring forever, to Psalm 137, which asks, how shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And so to the question, how in this seminar, how can we sing a song in a strange land? I think the tragic laments shows us how. Thank you for the privilege of presenting a paper here at the Kirby Lang Center for Public Theology, and for this privilege. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you.